something is wrong with your tomato. Not chemically wrong, not visually wrong, it looks fine, it looks perfect. In fact, that is the problem. The fruit sitting on your supermarket shelf was designed, carefully, deliberately, over decades, to look exactly like what you believe a tomato should look like: round, firm, uniformly red, unblemished, odorless. Almost. It was grown thousands of miles from where you stand, picked before it was alive, and ripened in a chamber filled with ethylene gas so that by the time it reaches your hand, it resembles something it never truly was. It was never allowed to ripen, it was never allowed to be itself. And here is the part that no label will tell you: the tomato you are buying today shares almost nothing with the plant that once fed entire civilizations. The flavors recorded by indigenous farmers in the high valleys of South America, the wild, irregular, deeply fragrant varieties that Europeans once feared so profoundly they refused to eat them for 200 years, the varieties that survived drought, war, and forgotten centuries without any human intervention at all. Those tomatoes still exist, quietly, in seed banks, in remote hillside gardens, in the hands of a very small number of people who never stopped growing them. But the system does not want you to know that, because what cannot be owned, cannot be sold, and what cannot be sold is, to that system, worthless. This is Ancient Food Files. We document the things that were buried, the plants, the practices, the agricultural knowledge that existed long before corporations wrote the history of food, not because the past was perfect, but because what was erased often held something irreplaceable. If this kind of history matters to you, subscribe, not for an algorithm, for the record, so that what is documented here does not disappear again. Before you continue watching, please check the link I provided in this video's description. That way, you can verify it yourself. Now, let us go back. Let us go back to a place where the tomato was not a commodity, where it was not a product, where it was something stranger, older, and far more powerful than anything you have ever purchased in a plastic-wrapped tray. The Andes Mountains of western South America, somewhere between what is now Ecuador and northern Peru. The elevation is considerable, the air is thin and dry, the soil is volcanic, ancient, mineral-rich in ways that modern agriculture has spent decades trying to replicate synthetically. This is where the tomato began, not in Italy, not in California, not in the greenhouses of the Netherlands. Here, in the wild margins of Andean civilization, climbing over rocks and riverbanks in small, clustered, intensely flavored forms no larger than a fingernail. The Aztecs called it tomato, a word from Nahuatl, the language of a civilization that did not make casual names for things. Tomato, the swelling fruit, and the swelling was important. The tomato, in its wild state, swells and bursts with something that has no modern equivalent, a concentrated acid sweetness that the Aztec cooks understood as a flavor base, a foundation, something to build upon. In Aztec market records from the early 16th century, recorded, ironically, by Spanish missionaries trying to document what they were about to destroy, there are descriptions of marketplaces where tomatoes were sold alongside chilies, squash, and maize in combinations that represent one of the world's earliest recorded flavor systems. These were not subsistence crops, they were a cuisine, an intentional, sophisticated, multi-generational body of knowledge about how the earth's flavors could be combined. The tomato plant itself is a perennial in its native climate. Left alone, it does not die at the end of summer, it retreats, it waits, it returns, the roots go deep and the vines sprawl unpredictably, seeking light with a kind of slow, wordless intelligence. The leaves are rough and strongly aromatic, that green, almost resinous scent that anyone who has grown a tomato plant from seed will recognize and that no supermarket fruit will ever carry. That scent is a warning system, a chemical language the plant uses to repel insects and attract specific pollinators, a biological conversation that has been happening, uninterrupted, for millions of years. The tomato is, biologically, a fruit, a berry, technically, though the law in some countries has ruled otherwise, for reasons having more to do with tariffs than botany. What makes it remarkable is not its flavor, though the flavor of a truly ripe tomato grown in real soil is extraordinary. What makes it remarkable is its resilience. The tomato plant carries within it an almost unreasonable set of survival tools. It can root from any point along its stem that touches soil, a process called adventitious rooting, meaning that a vine knocked over by wind or flood does not die, it begins again. It extends itself along the ground and sends up new growth from wherever contact is made. It tolerates heat that would collapse most crops. In its wild Andean form, it tolerates cold that would end the growing season for its cultivated descendants. Certain heritage varieties, the ones that were never industrialized, never bred for uniform appearance, carry disease resistance genes that modern hybrids had engineered out of them in the pursuit of a fruit that looked correct and traveled well. The wild tomato can also self-fertilize. It does not require bees, though it benefits from them. In conditions where pollinators have vanished, and they are vanishing, the wild tomato continues. This is not a fragile plant. It was never a fragile plant. It became fragile only when we decided that its natural form was inconvenient. In 1519, Hernán Cortés arrived in the Valley of Mexico. He found, among many things he did not understand, a civilization eating tomatoes. His soldiers brought seeds back to Europe. The Spanish planted them, the Italians planted them, and then, for approximately 200 years, almost no one in Europe ate them. The tomato was classified as a member of the nightshade family, which it is, and the nightshade family includes plants that kill. Belladonna, henbane, mandrake. The association was enough. The fruit was grown as an ornamental, a curiosity, something to be looked at, not consumed. There is a 1597 entry in John Gerard's Herbal, the most influential botanical text in Elizabethan England, in which he writes that the tomato is of rinca and stinking savor. He recommends against eating it. This fear lasted generations. It crossed continents. It is one of history's more remarkable examples of a civilization nearly starving itself out of ignorance of what was growing in its own gardens. And then famine came. In the mid-18th century, as population pressures and crop failures began reshaping European agriculture, the poor began eating what the wealthy had refused. In southern Italy, in particular, where poverty was severe and the climate was generous, the tomato was adopted with an urgency that had nothing to do with taste. It produced abundantly, it required little, it fed people who had very little else. By 1800, the tomato had become so central to Italian cooking that historians writing about the cuisine today speak as though it had always been there, as though it were native, as though the 200-year gap of fear and refusal never happened. That is how quickly food memory rewrites itself. The knowledge was never lost. That is the thing that history keeps trying to tell us. In the quiet way that history speaks, the seed banks in Svalbard hold thousands of tomato varieties. The seed libraries maintained by amateur growers across Europe and the Americas hold thousands more. The gardens of subsistence farmers in Mexico, Peru, and Ecuador hold varieties that no institution has ever catalogued. The tomato did not need saving, it saved itself, the way plants do, by being small enough to ignore, by being useful enough to keep, by being beautiful enough that someone always wanted to grow it. What was lost was not the plant, what was lost was the willingness to look at it honestly, to see it not as a product moving through a supply chain, but as a living system with a 400 million year history of surviving conditions that would end everything else. The soil does not care about quarterly earnings, the seed does not care about shelf life, the vine climbing toward light on a hillside in Peru is not waiting for permission. It was always going to outlast the system that tried to simplify it. It already has. If this history belongs somewhere other than forgotten, subscribe to Ancient Food Files. We document what was erased, so that the next time someone tells you this plant is ordinary, you will know exactly how extraordinary ordinary things can be.